The day a city fell, Nathan charged through the enemy ranks to save me. I thought his love for me ran deep, so I gave myself to him. But on our wedding night, he got blind drunk, murmuring my sister's name. If only it had been you I saved. Overcome with guilt and grief, I later died taking an arrow for him. And then, I woke up on the day a city fell. This time, I left my sister out in the open and crawled into a pile of the dead to survive. But when I finally emerged, I heard that the young General Nathan had gone mad. He'd fought his way through the ruined city 7 times, suffering 28 wounds, his armor stained crimson with blood. Sister, I'm so scared. My consciousness plunged into darkness like a cloud, and then I heard a whimper right beside me. I opened my eyes. The enemy's final arrow was still vivid in my mind. The sharp pain of the blade piercing my heart still seemed to linger. I had died for Nathan, and in doing so, I had found my peace. So even though my body ached, my heart had never felt so free, so light. But now, I looked down in confusion. My sister, who had been dead for 5 years, was clinging to my chest, trembling. I glanced around. We were hiding in a tiny corner under a worn-out straw mat. Outside, the sounds of battle raged. This familiar scene was the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me for years. Sister, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have gotten you into this mess. My sister's sob confirmed it. I had been reborn. Reborn 5 years ago, on the day a city fell. Back then, my parents had sent me to a city to audit the accounts of our family's shops. My younger sister, Zoe, tagged along out of curiosity. Just then the armies of attacked, and the governor of a city fled in the night with his valuables. The city descended into chaos. I hid Zoe under the straw mat and gave myself up, hoping to draw the soldiers away and give her a chance to escape. But Nathan intercepted them and saved me. My sister, however, was killed by looters in the confusion. In a time of chaos, our lives were like threads in the wind, like duckweed in the rain. After a period of grieving for their lost daughter, my parents decided to seize the day and not leave any regrets. They proposed a marriage to the Nathan family. A royal decree was issued, and Nathan and I were married in a simple ceremony. On the wedding day, my parents, who had been despondent for so long, looked somber. At the banquet, they kept stroking my sister's old belongings, refusing to even look at me. I waited in the bridal chamber, my face covered by a veil. Nathan never came. I lost my patience, lifted the veil myself, and went to find him. Under the cold moonlight, in the garden beneath a peach tree, Nathan was drunk, his sword dancing with the wind, his body moving like a graceful dragon. Hanging from a branch was a portrait of a beautiful woman. The woman in the painting was smiling, vivacious and full of life. She looked like me, but she wasn't me. After finishing a flagon of wine, Nathan collapsed against the tree, clutching the portrait and muttering to himself, "Why wasn't it you I saved?" It was then I realized that our supposed mutual affection was just a ridiculous misunderstanding. The one he had raced across half the kingdom for, the one he had risked his life to protect, was not me, the dull, uninteresting eldest daughter who spent her days with ledgers and accounts. It was the pampered, innocent, and carefree younger daughter. I felt so sorry, so guilty. Not for myself, but for him. And for my parents. I was the one who shouldn't have survived. When Nathan sobered up, he seemed to realize I knew what was in his heart, and he grew even more distant. For 5 years, we lived together in a cold, unspoken understanding. He never once blamed me to my face, but I never forgot. The clash of blades was getting closer. I heard soldiers with banners rushing past outside. Eleanor, daughter of the Prime Minister, is hiding in a city. 100 gold pieces for any information. There was no time. I pushed my thoughts aside, clamped my hand over my sister's mouth, and whispered, "Listen to me. Change into my clothes and walk straight ahead. Don't be afraid. General Nathan is coming. He'll meet you on Jade Flower Street." My sister stared at me stunned. She knew something was wrong, but she had always listened to me. Okay. I pressed a jade pendant into her hand. Nathan had lost it to me in a bet once. I had always thought of it as a token of our love, treasuring it for years until it was smooth and glossy from my touch. Later, I found out it was a gift from a relative in the jade business. He had 100 more just like it at home. In this world, Those who indulge in wishful thinking only end up trapping themselves. I squeezed her cheek gently, then paused. When you see General Nathan, tell him. My eyes suddenly reddened. Eleanor wishes him a long, prosperous, and peaceful life. And when I'm gone, you need to grow up. Take good care of our parents. They're getting old. After sending Zoe away, I clenched my teeth and waited under the straw mat. I heard the chaos outside reach a crescendo. Someone else is fighting their way in. Ack. They're grabbing people. I covered my mouth and struggled to crawl out from under the foul-smelling mat. The city gate of a city wasn't far. I stood on my toes and saw a flash of silver in the distance. It was Nathan's armor. He always wore silver armor and a silver cloak, making him stand out in any crowd. So majestic, so handsome. The man I had yearned for so many years. But that love was unrequited. Even if my heart was a raging fire, it had long since been frozen to ice. I stripped a coat from a dead beggar nearby and pulled it on, then took a small dagger from a fallen soldier. When I killed the first thug who tried to assault me, I felt a pang of pity and fear. But I got used to it quickly. Running on fumes, I made my way to a pile of the dead and climbed on top. With my last bit of strength, I pulled a corpse over me as camouflage. My eyelids grew heavier and heavier. Days of hiding and starvation had drained all my energy. From what I knew, the army didn't bother with finishing off bodies in corpse piles or setting them on fire. I hoped I'd be lucky. Of course, it wouldn't matter if I wasn't. To die for my country was a worthy end. I dreamed of the morning Nathan decided to fight to the death. He had gathered everyone to distribute his belongings. All his close friends received a final letter from him. Only I, his wife, opened the cloth bundle he left for me. Inside were just a few lonely pieces of gold. It felt like a mockery. Nathan was a man of honor. That gold was all he had left. To his country and his people, he truly had a clear conscience. As for me, if indifference wasn't considered cruelty, then he had fulfilled his duty. I woke up 5 days later. A city had completely fallen. The city walls were now adorned with the flags of the kingdom. Otherwise, the local accents of the people sounded the same as before. My injuries were so severe that I could only lie on the earthen bed and watch an old woman grind herbs for me. You look like you're from the capital, she said. The city has new masters now. You have no papers and can't go back. You should just rest here for a while. She blew on the medicinal soup and handed it to me, her eyes glistening with tears. My son went to the Chi Kingdom on business. He's not coming back. He's never coming back. I managed a weak smile. It's all right. A city is a vital pass for the Chi Kingdom. The court won't give it up easily. General Nathan is a brilliant strategist. He'll win it back soon. I remembered clearly. In my past life, a city became an obsession for Nathan. So that my sister's body wouldn't be left in enemy territory, he put on his armor the day after our wedding and rode to the battlefield. He retook the border in 2 months. I meant to comfort the old woman, but my words made her slap her forehead, her expression filled with regret. Oh, I forgot to tell you. The young General Nathan has gone mad. He's dying. A few days ago, he was rampaging through a city, hacking at people like a maniac. He took dozens of wounds, and his armor was soaked red with blood. No one knows if he's dead or alive. They had to drag him away. Miss. I had fainted for a moment. When my thoughts returned, I realized my fingers had gone slack. The medicine bowl had fallen and shattered on the floor. White porcelain fragments scattered everywhere. I scrambled out of bed to clean it up, but the old woman grabbed my arm. She looked at me with a complicated expression. It's all right. I know you're hurting. It's okay to cry. A lump formed in my throat, and the sorrow in my heart was suddenly hard to put into words. But I still said I won't cry. The me from 5 years later was an expert at goodbyes. I had long since cried all my tears of grief and cast aside useless mourning. As things piled up, I grew more and more numb. Whether Nathan survived or not, for me, the most important thing was to stay alive and repay the old woman's kindness. I got out of bed and knelt before her. I bowed my head low. My forehead touched the stone steps with a dull thud. Without you, I would not be here today. I am the eldest daughter of the Prime Minister of Qi. Now we have both been separated from our families, lost in a foreign city. Though I have no gold or silver, nor any great power, I am willing to devote my life to you, to be by your side, to honor you as a mother and care for you for the rest of your days. Please, accept me as your adopted daughter." I knelt for a long time without hearing a response. Just as I was starting to feel anxious, something cool landed on my head. I looked up and saw the old woman covering her mouth, sobbing uncontrollably. She helped me up. "Next time you introduce yourself, just say your name." I later learned that the old woman who saved me was named Mrs. Miller. I called her Mrs. Miller. I didn't become her adopted daughter. Instead, I took on the identity of her son. Daniel Miller had been a traveling merchant who wasn't often in a city, so not many people knew his face. In her youth, Mrs. Miller had run a cosmetics shop and was a famous makeup artist in the city. But as she got older, her hands grew weak and her eyesight faded. Plus, her son was successful, so she no longer needed her old trade to support herself. After so many years, she took out her old tools again. With a brush, she gently painted her son's features onto my face. When I opened my eyes, the person in the bronze mirror was a stranger. I had transformed from a reasonably pretty young woman into a young man. I slowly reached out to touch my cheek. The line between my past and present lives blurred. For a moment, I wondered if this was all a long dream. Mrs. Miller told me that with the makeup, my features were already very similar to her son's. But I was still a woman, so my jawline lacked a man's bone structure. She then applied a gel-like substance and some pigment to the sides of my face, bonding it to my skin to create scars that looked like burns. This way, even people who had known Daniel wouldn't be suspicious if they saw me, as they would attribute any changes in my features to the injuries. The finished scars were hideous. I would likely have to wear them for years. Mrs. Miller held me and cried. "A girl's face is so important to her. You've suffered so much." She said she felt sorry for me, that it was a terrible waste. But I couldn't tell if her sorrow was also stirring her own grief, her own memories of a son who would never return. It didn't matter. She saved my life. I was willing to be her emotional anchor. After I recovered, my first job was clearing the dead. Leaving corpses on the streets was a problem. Not only did they smell, but they could also contaminate the water supply and lead to plagues. The soldiers didn't want to do such a thankless job, so the work was given to desperate people like me. 20 cents for a full day of clearing bodies. The pay was pitifully low, but it allowed me to build my strength and practice walking and acting like a man. The stench from the piles of the dead was often overwhelming. Most of them were soldiers from Chi, their faces twisted in agony. Even the freshest corpses reeked of iron and gunpowder. The rest were ordinary people in ragged clothes. They were of all ages. Old men with white hair, men and women in their prime, and even small children. Their bodies were usually intact, but it wasn't a pretty sight. Most of them were emaciated, their faces sallow and gaunt. I could carry 2 of them at once. The war between Chi and Xia never really stopped. After Nathan was gravely injured, the 2 nations were locked in a stalemate. Losing one general was no great matter. Both kingdoms had millions of people. If one general fell, thousands more would take his place. They made up for a lack of quality with quantity. I threw myself into my new identity. Sometimes, as I toiled day after day just to survive, I would wonder, was being the Prime Minister's daughter just a dream? But through it all, Mrs. Miller was there for me. When I was on the verge of collapse, she would help me up. "The dead are gone," she would say, "but you are still alive." When I was too exhausted to stand, she would grab my arm and drag me along. "Get up for my sake, won't you? If you expose yourself in the city, I'll be in trouble too." I swallowed the blood in my throat. Okay. Years passed in a blur. I survived the initial adjustment period and gradually took over the businesses Daniel Miller had left behind in a city. I moved through the city again, my impersonation flawless. That winter was especially cold. It killed many insects and many people. They declared a temporary truce. Both sides needed to rest and recuperate. Life gradually stabilized. But this stability felt more like a sheet of ice on a raging sea. No one knew how many treacherous reefs lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the ice to break. But even a false peace was enough to wipe away most of the gloom from people's faces. They didn't want to think about the future, they focused on the present. Like mayflies, born at dawn and dead by dusk. All that mattered was the day's dew, the day's sun. The following spring, I heard some good news. I was in a tavern. A young man in silk robes was holding court, surrounded by a crowd of servants and patrons. The sound of cracking melon seeds filled the air. The young man's vanity was greatly satisfied, and his voice grew louder. The young General Nathan of Qi is about to marry the eldest daughter of the Meng family. I took a few steps forward with the fish I was carrying, then stepped back. General Nathan and who? I asked. When the young man saw my face, he jumped and quickly covered his eyes with a gold-flecked fan. He seemed to remember the gentlemanly principle of not judging a book by its cover, and reluctantly lowered the fan. He tilted his chin up. The Prime Minister of daughter, Eleanor, of course. I was confused. But isn't she dead? Even if she wasn't dead, she was missing. Was Nathan going to marry a memorial tablet? The young man was instantly offended. I didn't realize your heart was as ugly as your face. It's their wedding. A joyous occasion for all. What right does an ugly brute like you have to spout such nonsense? A joyous occasion for all? So my parents were happy too. I spaced out for a moment. It really was true. If I was the one who disappeared, everyone would be happier. The young man flicked his fan, a dreamy look on his face. They are a match made in heaven. Did you know the general's wounds, which took him half a year to recover from, were all for Miss? The day a city fell, Miss was lost among the soldiers. The general, in a fit of righteous fury for his love, fought his way through the city 7 times. A true hero. Shaking off my thoughts, I had no interest in listening to his gossip. I picked up my fish and turned to leave. Mrs. Miller hadn't been well lately, worrying too much. I needed to find a way to nurse her back to health. I usually braise this fish, but today I'd try something new. Perhaps I had let out an unconscious scoff. The young man's pride was wounded. He hurried after me, hopping mad. You ignorant commoner. Do you have any idea who I am? I am the heir of the family of Jiangdong. We are merchants to the crown, supplying both kingdoms with the finest silks, teas, and sugars. Even in wartime, both sides have to show me some respect. I had never heard someone announce their entire resume during an argument before. I could practically see the words "rich idiot son" glittering above his head. His servants, heads bowed, tugged fiercely at his sleeve. His eyes darted around as if he'd just remembered something, and he immediately deflated, lowering his voice. I'm here on important business. Unlike you, who just eats all day. He muttered the last 2 sentences, but I still heard them. The old me would have despised a fool like this. Even when I occasionally tutored my own sister in the classics, if she didn't get it after 2 tries, I would calmly dismiss the maids and tutors, then take out a ruler and strike her palms sharply. But now, having seen so much suffering of all kinds, having seen so many people worn smooth by life, every lost edge a testament to painful tempering and worldly pressures. When I saw someone this genuinely naive, I could sense a quality in him called happiness. It had a warm smell. It even seemed to dilute the scent of death that perpetually clung to me. I forced a smile. Mister, perhaps we'll meet again. By now, I rarely thought of Nathan. But tonight was an exception. I dreamed of him again. Perhaps it was because I had met that sweet, clueless Spencer. My dream was a sweet one. I dreamed that after I died in my previous life, Nathan fought his way out of the chaos and escaped. The frail old emperor of Qi died, and the 7th prince, a good friend of Nathan's, took the throne. After a period of rest and reform, they marshaled their forces and reclaimed all of Qi's lost territories. The day the peace treaty was signed, Nathan rode his white horse from the sandy deserts of the border all the way to the blooming capital. On a willow-lined causeway, he met a beautiful, radiant woman. He was stunned. Zoe waved her fingers in front of his face, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. What's wrong? Scared to see I'm not dead? Everyone crowded around. Mrs. Miller stood tall and proud, supported by her handsome son Daniel. His face was much clearer than mine, with no deliberate scars. My parents, hand in hand, wore formal attire, their smiles touched by the willow branches. Spencer, whom I'd met only once, fanned himself, his mouth running a mile a minute. On the roadside, a scholar with a book basket held hands with his wife and son, reciting passages under his breath. The soldiers on guard duty, all burly and strong, rested their heads on the butts of their upright spears, dozing off. Countless faces I recognized passed by me, through me, all of them smiling. I wasn't in this world. But that was okay. Everyone was happy enough. I, weary to my bones, was swept away by a gentle breeze, and I was happy too. My hands were empty, and my heart was empty, but I still woke up. I was startled awake by a violent coughing fit. In the dim lamplight, I saw Mrs. Miller sitting up in bed. She was curled over, covering her mouth, trying to muffle the sound of her coughs in her hands. She noticed I was awake and looked up at me, her eyes a bit hazy. "Daniel," she called out. My heart clenched. I quickly got up and supported her slumping body. Her skin was burning hot. In the spring, when all things came back to life, Mrs. Miller's illness had struck like a collapsing mountain. I stayed up all night taking care of her. When she finally dozed off at dawn, I pulled out the letters I had hidden under the bed. I had been considering contacting my family recently, but now I'd mostly given up the idea. I didn't understand their motive for creating a fake Eleanor, but I figured it must be for everyone's benefit. If I suddenly reappeared, I would likely disrupt their plans. The dim candlelight flickered across the paper. As I watched the inked pages curl and turn to ash, my heart surprisingly felt lighter. I didn't have to face them again. I still remembered last year when I missed my mother's birthday banquet because I was inspecting the shops. I knelt in the main hall to apologize. My mother tapped my head with her fan. You are a cold-hearted child. Your heart is full of nothing but calculations." I kept my head down, saying nothing, but in my heart, I thought, "Mother, you never seem to teach me anything about love." Once Mrs. Miller's condition improved a little, I went to handle a deal that had been delayed for several days. In a deserted alley, the servant who came to meet me wore a veiled hat. "Sir, this transaction is quite sensitive. My master takes it very seriously, and is already waiting in the hall." I nodded slightly and followed the servant through a maze of winding alleys before slowly entering the main hall. Inside stood a large screen embroidered with a shoe silk tapestry of overlapping mountains and flowing water. The master sat behind it, his form completely hidden by the ink-wash landscape. "The matter is of great importance. Please forgive the precautions, sir." That familiar voice, though intentionally lowered, my hearing was exceptional, and I recognized it clearly. I stumbled. After I became familiar with Daniel Miller's trade routes, I learned that while he appeared to be a cloth merchant, he was also involved in a business that could get him beheaded. He sold iron. While he didn't sell weapons directly, he sold the raw materials to make them. He would acquire the materials and smuggle them into the interior. When I discovered this, for a while I thought he was a spy. Only later did I realize he was just an ordinary merchant, loving his country a little while making a living. I had taken over his illicit business, but hadn't had a chance to operate it until now. It had taken a great deal of effort to contact a buyer. When I saw Spencer, I only knew he was to present tribute porcelain. I never expected him to be the one wading into these murky waters. I remained silent for a long moment, then, after a pause, I tried to lower my own voice. "No matter. I was betting that Spencer's hearing wasn't as good as mine. I seemed to have lost that bet." After I spoke, an almost suffocating silence filled the hall. A long moment later, a terrified shriek came from behind the screen. "Nathan! Help me!" Instantly, I felt a sharp presence behind me. A corner of my mask cracked. A severed lock of my hair drifted slowly down. A blade silently came to rest against the side of my neck. The blade was polished to a mirror shine. It had been recently sharpened. The tip was slightly curved into a sharp hook. The spine was thick, with a deep blood groove carved every few inches. This kind of blade was heavy and looked clumsy, difficult to wield, which was why scholars often dismissed it as crude when writing about weaponry. But it was a common weapon in the army, because every inch of it was designed for one thing: killing. Nathan was an expert with this kind of blade. Fate, it seemed, always came full circle in such unpredictable ways. I saw Spencer come tumbling out from behind the screen. He ran over, pointing at my nose, furious. I saw him in the tavern before. This is no coincidence. Our operation must be exposed. Kill him and let's get out of here. The voice behind me was cold and restrained, like an echo from another life. Let's interrogate him first. Spencer, you go. The blade pressed deeper against my neck. The remaining half of my mask fell to the ground. I was forced, step by step, into a chair. Nathan sat down in front of me, legs apart, a commanding presence. After nearly 2 years, he had grown much thinner. He lowered his head and gently wiped his blade. The light reflecting off it cast his face in shadow and light. He looked as fierce as a demon. My heart sank. I couldn't help but wonder what he had been through these past 2 years. Even at the very end of my previous life, Nathan had never worn such a weary and cruel expression. You are? I lowered my eyes obediently. A humble commoner, Daniel Miller. Daniel Miller? As if he'd heard something amusing, Nathan savored the name. When he looked up, the tip of his blade was at my forehead. Daniel Miller is already dead, he said slowly. His tone was so calm. It reminded me of the ashes of burnt paper money scattering in the wind by a grave. I said nothing. My heart ached. The Jiang family has always been neutral. Although Spencer is the heir, he's been a troublemaker for years and never been given any real responsibility. His coming to Xia to present porcelain is a reasonable cover. I, by all rights, should be in the capital for my wedding. I've been wondering, how did you figure us out? Your disguise is perfect. Your mannerisms, your appearance, it's almost flawless. If I hadn't happened to run into Daniel Miller's caravan once, I wouldn't have been able to tell. This matter is extremely secret. For you to have set a trap in advance, I have to suspect that a high-ranking official in Qi is pulling the strings. Your deductions are excellent. Please stop deducing. I kept my head down, my mind racing. If I get killed here, what will happen to Mrs. Miller? But if I reveal my identity, will anyone believe me? And besides, I didn't want him to recognize me like this. But I quickly realized all my thinking was pointless. With a creak, the door that had just been closed swung open again. A woman in a veil stepped inside, her movements calm and unhurried. General Nathan, I know you've returned to a place of painful memories and your spirits are low. For a moment, you might not want to live. I know you're staying here to stall for time even though our plan is exposed. But you still have much to do. We need to go. I just asked around, and I didn't get any. The woman was fiddling with an abacus, her tone steady. When she suddenly looked up, her eyes met mine. The wind lifted her veil. For a moment my head spun. It was simple. She looked so much like me. Looking at her was like seeing myself 2 years ago. Not just her appearance and mannerisms, but even her eyes were exactly the same. I had looked in the mirror before. The me in the mirror had eyes that were old and tired, gloomy and weary. Though I ate well enough, my constant anxiety had made me painfully thin. I was stunned. She too froze on the spot. Tears suddenly welled up and streamed down her face. She trembled, grabbing the window frame for support, her veil now damp. Nathan frowned. What's wrong with you now? Why haven't you left yet? She wiped her tears, choking out her words. I don't know. Something feels familiar. I can't explain it. I closed my eyes. I opened my mouth, but in the end I said nothing. My dear sister, you told me so many times that I was boring, that I was rigid, that I was like a little old man. You said you wanted a life of freedom, wandering the world. You wanted to be a swordswoman, smiling among the flowers on a mountain peak. You wanted to be a poet immortal, astounding the world with a single verse from a small boat. And though I knew you couldn't fight and didn't like to read, I never imagined this. You finally became the person you once hated most. The eldest daughter of the Meng family. Nathan followed Zoe's gaze and whipped his head around to look at me. His face was a mask of dreamlike astonishment. I awkwardly fidgeted with my hands. Then slowly, so slowly, he lowered his blade. His hand was trembling. The blade finally slipped from his grasp. It clattered to the floor. He covered his face with his hands, like a traveler returning home after a long absence, afraid to look. 2 years isn't a short time, but it's not long either. The summary was quick. After Zoe returned to the capital, she collapsed in her courtyard and didn't move for 3 months. With no one to manage the family's business networks, and considering that news of my death would cause instability, she worried that if she took over, her inexperience would make her an easy target for those looking to sabotage her. So she took the initiative and put out the news that it was the eldest daughter, Eleanor Meng, who had been rescued from the chaos, and that Zoe Meng had died in the fighting. She and I already looked quite similar. With a veil to hide her face and diligent practice imitating my daily habits, she managed. While her parents hired tutors to help her learn how to manage the household, she aggressively downsized the family's branch businesses to prevent herself from making mistakes in the confusion. In the end, she barely managed to stabilize the family's assets. This time, taking advantage of the temporary truce, Nathan had used Spencer as a front to enter a city, hoping to buy some raw iron and gather intelligence, perhaps planting a few spies. She had tagged along, hoping to find some trace of me. Zoe held my hand, sobbing her heart out. Looking at the sister who had aged 20 years in two, my heart was a mix of complicated feelings. I had to ask Spencer to help her outside to rest. In a moment, the large room was empty except for Nathan and me. Nathan was looking at me, his gaze almost feverish. I stood up awkwardly and moved to a spot far away from him. Tell me about Daniel Miller. Nathan seemed disappointed. Aren't you going to ask about me? I choked for a second, remembering his supposed wedding. I have nothing to say. Everything worked out fine, didn't it? Daniel Miller had died 2 years ago. He had just sold a shipment of iron. He had packed up his things, mounted his horse, and left the caravan, taking a small path. He told the others, a city is a mess right now. I'm going to check on my mother. We'll get back to business when I return. Unfortunately, he ran into bandits on the road. They chased him relentlessly. He was wounded but managed to escape, finally collapsing right into the path of Nathan's carriage, which was heading back to the capital. Nathan's guards killed the bandits and brought Daniel to rest by Nathan's side. Nathan himself was severely wounded at the time, conscious for less than an hour each day. But by chance he happened to be awake then. Daniel was a lively person. After some anesthetic to numb the pain, he chattered endlessly in Nathan's ear, telling him his life story. Nathan had been forced to listen for a long time. Besides all that, I asked, did he leave any last words? Nathan thought for a moment. Toward the end of the night, when he was dying, he just called for his mother for half the night. I fell silent. Nathan pulled a small cloth pouch from his sleeve. This is all they found on him. A letter and a pair of earrings. I took the small pouch. It felt strangely heavy. We'll discuss the future in detail tomorrow, I said. I started to walk away but nearly ran into Nathan's chest. He was blocking my path. Let me look at you. I lowered my head, avoiding his touch. My face is ruined now. If you're looking to mock me, there's no need. But to my surprise, he suddenly bent down, took my chin in his hand, and forced me to meet his gaze. Let me see your eyes. The black of Nathan's eyes swirled with an undercurrent of disbelieving, wild joy. It's really you. That joy was so self-assured. Right now, I hated it when people looked into my eyes. I was afraid they could see the exhaustion and weariness there. Not sunny at all. Not positive in the slightest. I shoved him away hard. I left just like that. It was still early when I left, but I dawdled, my pace growing slower and slower. By the time I reached the courtyard where Mrs. Miller lived, the sky was dark, and lanterns were already lit along the street. I clutched the small pouch in my hand, and spent a long time adjusting my expression in the reflection on the water. When I finally managed to look less dejected, I stepped through the gate. After she took her medicine, I placed a pillow behind her back. Your illness is almost gone, I said. And I have good news today. I knelt down and carefully handed her the items. I have news of your son. He sent you earrings and a letter. Mrs. Miller was overjoyed. Her clouded eyes suddenly lit up. She opened the letter and caressed it, holding it up to the light for a long time. Then reluctantly she handed it back to me. I'm old. My eyes are blurry. You read it to me. The letter blocked my vision. My heart felt sour, with a faint hint of envy. I slowly unfolded the paper. The writing was a flamboyant, cursive script. My dearest mother, may this letter find you well. I am currently traveling in Jiangling. The mountain flowers here are in full bloom. and I wished to pick a branch of late-blooming cherry blossoms to send to you, a token of the spring. But the journey is long, and the wind and rain would surely damage it, robbing it of its beauty and sentiment. So, I commissioned a craftsman to create a pair of cherry blossom earrings. May we share the same view under the same sky. Take care. I gently put the earrings on for Mrs. Miller, and brought her a bronze mirror. The pale pink gems shimmered as she moved, catching the watery light in her eyes. From a worldly perspective, pink earrings don't really suit an old woman. Only vibrant young girls are meant to fuss with flowers and grass. Old age calls for solemnity and poise. But in a son's eyes, a mother never grows old. It was spring again. I wondered if, 1,000 miles away in Jiangling, the cherry blossoms still fell like snow, covering the city in a canopy of white. Mrs. Miller's spirits seemed to genuinely improve. She even asked me, "Have you been to Jiangling? Have you seen such a sight?" I faltered. "I've always been there on business. I never paid attention." After helping her to bed, I sat there for a long time. Finally, I picked up the mirror and looked at myself. The eyes staring back at me were indeed filled with a gloom I couldn't hide. I hoped Mrs. Miller hadn't noticed. In the middle of the night, I heard someone lightly tossing pebbles at my window. I had to get up and put on a robe to check. Sure enough, standing in the middle of the courtyard was a tall, imposing figure. As a boy, Nathan had loved to climb things and throw pebbles at my window, because it would always make an angry Zoe chase him with a broom. The Nathan of today wasn't old, but there was a gravity about him now. Seeing him holding a pebble felt strangely, absurdly out of place. I was suddenly overcome with exhaustion. I started to walk away, and he followed, step for step. "You didn't ask me about the wedding today," he said. "So I came to tell you myself." The alley was pitch black. I couldn't see his expression. I just felt him stumble on a rock and stop short. I waited a long time. Finally, I heard his voice, thick with emotion. "You know, in my past life and this one, it has only ever been you. I never married anyone else." He said it with such weight, and with a hint of pain. I paused. I wasn't really surprised. Nathan's behavior was so different from my past life, and his eyes were completely different. I almost laughed out of sheer frustration. "Do you even believe that yourself?" "At first I didn't understand," he said. "But later, you were so gentle and virtuous. In the past life, it was only me out of a reluctant compromise. In this life, it was only me." I tilted my head, cutting him off. "So, are you in love with me, or are you in love with how good I was to you?" Nathan froze. I continued, "The reason I fell for you was because I thought you loved me. I knew. My friends and family in the capital, the eligible young men, even my own parents, they didn't really like me. They loved Zoe more. And that was normal. Compared to a stern, silent young woman, a lively, cheerful girl who loved to give praise and compliments was far more likable. They knew my capabilities, respected my composure, and admired my talents. They would praise me to my face while complaining about Zoe. When there was a problem to be solved, they came to me first. But that wasn't love. It was just acknowledging the utility of a tool. The first time I met Nathan was at a flower viewing party. The young men had all agreed to prepare a jade pendant to give to the girl they admired most, as a way to rank the beauties of the capital. That day, I only received one pendant. It was from Nathan. That night, I held the pendant and dreamed. I dreamed that someone loved me with their whole heart. I dreamed that dream for a long time, until one day, I discovered that Nathan had secretly brought many different pendants. He gave one to every girl. His intention was to make sure no girl went home empty-handed. But for me it was a profound insult. The affection I had developed for him should have faded then, but instead, it became an addiction. It grew stubborn, and it intensified. That addiction festered for years, eventually mixing with the guilt from my sister's death. Until I was reborn. Stranded in a foreign land, though I was no longer wealthy or secure, I no longer owed anyone anything. And so, I felt a sense of relief. That obsession in my heart gradually faded. The feelings I had for him truly came like a storm, and left like a speck of dust. My mother said I was cold-hearted. I think she was right. Everything in this world can be measured. Before I give anything, I prefer to receive first. As I walked away, Nathan stood frozen in place. He called out behind me, "I won't give up." I didn't look back once. I had no desire to return to the capital. I told them I was willing to stay in a city as Nathan's spy, to pass along information. When I announced this decision, all three of them at the dinner table fell silent. Spencer, who had only recently figured out the whole situation with me and Zoe, looked bewildered. "You just barely survived. Why aren't you cherishing your life?" Zoe said. "I disagree." Nathan said no. I looked at them both. "You don't get to decide." Zoe instantly deflated like a defeated rooster and slunk out of the room. Once we were alone, I looked at Nathan, who had been staring at the table in silence. "You, of all people, should know I'm the most suitable choice." "For the country?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "But it's what I have to do." A long silence followed. I almost thought time had stopped. Then Nathan suddenly stood up. He slammed his fist into the wall. A spiderweb of cracks appeared. A thin line of blood trickled from between his knuckles, staining his sleeve. He looked up and stared at me. I realized his eyes were bloodshot, the pupils dark and hopeless like an abyss. But he still didn't say a word. He just slowly walked past me. His hard shoulder plate brushed against my arm. It hurt. As he passed, he shed more tears than blood. The iron business was handed over to other trusted people. I joined the army as a low-level cook. This false peace lasted longer than in my previous life. I was grateful. If Nathan had once been just a brave vanguard, he had now become a cunning and far-sighted general. He no longer coveted victories won by momentary valor, but had learned to endure, to plant seeds, to plan for the long game. I knew what he was thinking. He wanted to end this war in one decisive blow. One day, on my day off, I got home very late. A drunk lieutenant had kicked me, and my back ached. The pain was so bad I could barely control my expression. I leaned against the wall for a long time, then gritted my teeth and, with a shaky hand, wrote another letter in Daniel's script. I also had a necklace with a pine and cypress motif custom made. 1 letter a month, without fail. In the letters, I vividly described the beautiful landscapes and strange tales from my travels. Sometimes, as I read the letters aloud, I could almost fool myself, my spirit soaring to those places, easing my pain. I held the envelope up to Mrs. Miller in the candlelight. "Your son wrote again. My dearest mother, may this letter find you well. I am currently in the Loo Mountains, a place of overlapping peaks and magnificent scenery. I heard you have been ill, and I often toss and turn at night, my heart burning with anxiety. I have obtained a consecrated prayer wheel from a temple, which I turn constantly for your well-being. I have also had this pine and cypress necklace carved as a token of my devotion. May you have the longevity of the pines and cranes, and the brilliance of the sun and moon." Perhaps hearing news of her son gave Mrs. Miller the will to live. Her physical and mental health improved considerably. She even opened her eyes wide and found the strength to scold that unfilial boy. I stroked her head. "The situation between the two kingdoms is still tense. He can't get through. Then when is he coming back?" I tilted my head. "Probably after the war is truly over." Mrs. Miller looked at me earnestly. "I hope that one day, you too will see such scenery." I smiled a careless smile. "We'll see. In less than 2 years, thanks to my hard work, my eloquence, and my clean record, and perhaps with a little help from some unseen forces, I rose through the ranks fairly quickly. In less than 2 years, I became a captain, able to serve low-ranking officers directly. In the middle of the night, I heard pebbles hitting my window again. I fumbled out of bed and saw a tall, statuesque guardian standing in the courtyard. The guardian turned his face, a face that was infinitely close to the General Nathan from my past life's memories. He stared at me, and this time his gaze was even longer than before. His voice was heavier, too. "The old emperor is dead. The 7th prince has taken the throne. We're going to war. What are our chances?" I asked. 50-50. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling a strange tension. And the old emperor had died so much earlier this time. In my past life, at this point, he was still robust enough to be planning his 60th birthday celebration. No doubt, one of the princes had used some special method to help the old man kick the bucket sooner. Truly a case of filial piety. I want to take you away tonight, Nathan said urgently. Once the fighting starts, it will be chaotic. I won't be able to protect you. You shouldn't have come, I said. If someone recognizes you now, you'll be killed. I might still be of some use here. I was exhausted. I waved my hand, wanting to go back to bed. I had only taken a few steps when he grabbed my wrist. With a slight pull, he yanked me into his arms, holding me tight. A hoarse voice came from above my head. I just thought, what if this is the last time we see each other? He said slowly, regardless of the outcome, if you die this time, I won't live without you. I sighed. What you do is none of my business. I have my own path to follow. The day Nathan had set for the attack arrived quickly. That night, I was standing in front of the army's granary when I heard a sharp, piercing whistle. An orange firework exploded in the sky. Amid the massive boom, countless people looked up, marveling at its beauty. But a faint, earth-shattering roar was rolling in from the distance. A wave of hot wind carrying a smell of blood thicker than ever before washed over us, almost suffocating. In the chaos, I hid in a corner, changed my clothes, and slipped back to the house in the alley where Mrs. Miller was. For the past 2 years, I could have sent her to live in another city. It would have been safer. But Mrs. Miller always refused. Her health had been getting worse and worse these past 2 years, and she was often not lucid. Today, she had fallen into a deep sleep again. This was dangerous for a frail, elderly woman. I couldn't wake her, so I pulled another piece of paper from inside my shirt and tried the old trick. Your son wrote again. The light was dim. I held the paper to the side so she couldn't see it was blank. Because I hadn't prepared anything, I read in a halting voice. My dearest mother, may this letter find you well. I hear the times are turbulent lately. I hope you will take care of yourself and be careful. Barring any accidents, we should see each other very soon. Mrs. Miller struggled to open her eyes. Really? I went over and gently squeezed her shoulder. Really? We looked at each other for a long time in silence. In the air, the soft crackling of the candle flame was starkly clear. Mrs. Miller finally closed her eyes, convinced. She murmured, I know. I can feel it too. Daniel and we're going to see each other soon. She said it with such devotion that a faint unease stirred in my heart. I raised the candlestick, wanting to get a closer look at her expression. But a raised hand stopped me. Go to your room and rest. Her expression was calm and serene, with none of the anxiety of a long-suffering patient. I had a bad feeling, but seeing her resolute attitude, I had no choice but to take the lamp and leave. The moment I stepped out of the room, I heard a faint sigh from the darkness behind me. You know, I've known for a while that my Daniel is gone. What will you do now? Where do you want to go? My whole body shook. Outside, the sky was ablaze, and the sounds of fighting were deafening. But none of it compared to the shock in my heart. I whipped around. The candlestick fell from my hand, clattering on the floor. I was speechless, and could only fall to my knees. I'm sorry. But there was no scolding, no resentment. I hung my head, feeling a hand gently stroke my hair. Mrs. Miller's voice was muffled. You've never once said what you want to do. If I told you that I tried to stay alive, for you, would that make you a little happier? I froze. I touched my cheek. I didn't know when, but my face was wet with tears. I remember when I asked Nathan and Zoe not to tell my parents I was still alive. Nathan asked me why I had refused to leave Mrs. Miller's side all these years. Did I love her that much? Had she done that much for me? I told him none of that mattered. In my heart, duty was the heaviest burden. Mrs. Miller saved my life and gave me an identity. It was my duty to be her emotional support, to care for her for the rest of her life. During that time, I would expect nothing in return. As for my parents and my sister, after managing the family estate for so many years, I had already repaid my debt to them. But now Mrs. Miller was telling me she had held on for so long, for me. In that moment, I suddenly understood. The one who had needed someone to lean on all along was me. The sounds of battle raged outside all night, finally stopping at dawn. I sat on the floor, my back against the low bed, watching a light rain begin to fall outside the window, carrying the scent of fresh grass. I took a white cloth from a chest and covered Mrs. Miller's body. Then I slowly took out a file, and began scraping the scar from my face. The skin underneath, long hidden from the sun, was fragile and pale. After I finished, I gave it a quick glance, then collapsed onto the floor in exhaustion and fell asleep. When I woke up, my head was resting on a pair of cold knees. Nathan was still in his armor, the white plume on his helmet stained with blood. He looked down at me and smiled. A smile that seemed to take him back to his carefree, innocent youth. "Eleanor, it's all over. Come home with me." In the distance, I heard my sister pick up a discarded saber in the courtyard. She had removed her veil and was hopping around, as if she had been rejuvenated overnight. "What's this for?" she asked, puzzled. I dodged Nathan's outstretched hand and coolly took the saber from her. "I was planning to go out last night and just start swinging at people." Zoe covered her mouth with a gasp. "Sister, why do you always have to do such dangerous things?" A gentle rain fell like a soft veil, cool against my face. I thought of Mrs. Miller, lying so still in the room just a wall away, and I suddenly found the courage to give a real answer. When you don't have anything you want to do, living feels meaningless. You do dangerous things because you're afraid of dying for no reason. I had always believed that I myself had no value. Only the things I did had value. That's why I would manage the household without complaint. It's why I felt guilty that Nathan had saved the wrong person. It's why I would take an arrow for him, give my sister the chance to live, take over Daniel's business, and become Nathan's spy in a city. But Mrs. Miller told me she endured her illness just so that I myself could live. Nathan reached for my hand, his face etched with worry. I slapped it away. For the first time, I looked him straight in the eye, defiant. "This marriage of ours? I don't recognize it. So what if it was arranged by our parents? It was your wishful thinking, not mine." Nathan was stunned. His expression was hard to describe, like a child who had been punched twice in the middle of a happy game. Blank and helpless. He reached out to help me up. I slapped him across the face, leaving a big red mark. "When you liked me, you were so earnest." I spat. "When you didn't, you were cold and dismissive, never once considering my feelings." "Nathan, what do you take me for? Some cheap thing?" Saying those words was like opening a small crack in my repressed heart. Like a small boat, tossed about in a storm for years, always precariously balanced. But suddenly, the hull was breached, and the flood was unstoppable. I slammed the saber down at my feet and stomped on it. I started attacking everyone indiscriminately. "Don't call me sister. You don't have a sister. She died 5 years ago. Spencer, are you an idiot? I told you, my name is not sister-in-law. And don't call me Daniel Miller. I don't know him either." I don't know how long I yelled. My legs finally gave out, and I fell into a warm embrace. Before me were several faces, all stunned and worried. I closed my eyes. "I'm not going back." After a few moments of silence, I heard a trembling reply. "Okay." The next day, the small courtyard where I had lived caught fire. Mrs. Miller and her son were buried on the same day. On a suburban hillside, 2 simple stone markers were erected. Beneath them lay the old woman's body and the young man's hastily written letters. Here their souls, nestled by the mountains and sea, could gaze at the sky forever. I wore a veiled hat and boarded a small boat to Jiangling. The docks of a city had just reopened. They were bustling with commoners and scholars, all crowded together, yet all with smiles on their faces. I sat among them. The smell of cooking fires and humanity made me drowsy. I suddenly remembered that day. I knelt before Mrs. Miller. "I am the eldest daughter of the Prime Minister of Qi." Mrs. Miller silently helped me up. "Next time you introduce yourself," she said, "just say your name." Eleanor had come from a world of mountains and distant rivers, and was now headed for a place where the spring flowers bloomed in profusion. The end.